Welcome everyone to Half History Will Travel. I am your host, the Wilder Historian, and I'm excited to deliver this video to you. The Battle of Fredericksburg has captured the imaginations of many, attempting to imagine wave after wave of Union brigades crashing up against the Confederate battle line. For this animation, I gave the patrons on Patreon the choice of either the Confederate left, where Longstreet defended Marye's Heights, or Jackson defending Prospect Hill, and Jackson won. At the end of the month, I will be animating the Battle of Stones River. If you want to choose which aspect of the battle you want me to cover, join the Patreon for as little as $1 and you can cast your ballot. The Union Army in the East had changed hands multiple times by the end of 1862. Abraham Lincoln needed a commander who would be aggressive if he wanted to eliminate Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. Lincoln chose Ambrose Burnside, a corps commander in the Army of the Potomac. In a display of humility, Burnside turned down the appointment to command the army, believing himself to be unqualified. After Lincoln informed him that McClellan would be replaced and it would go to Joseph Hooker, Burnside took the position to prevent it falling into the hands of Hooker, who Burnside had disagreements with. The Army of the Potomac was the largest it had ever been, at around 130,000 troops. It was a massive juggernaut knocking on the door of the Confederacy. It had been divided into three grand divisions, the right commanded by Edwin Sumner, the center commanded by Joseph Hooker, and the left commanded by William B. Franklin. Robert E. Lee's army numbered around 80,000, and in true Lee fashion, he had divided his army in two prior to the battle. Jackson was on the north end of the Shenandoah Valley, and Longstreet's men were near Culpeper Courthouse. Burnside's large force hindered his movement south toward Richmond, making the advance slow, which provided Lee enough time to maneuver Longstreet's corps to Fredericksburg. Jackson moved at a forced march pace to join Lee there. Longstreet's men took a position on Marye's Heights, and Jackson would fall in to his right, Jackson's lines running parallel to the railroad at Prospect Hill. Although some Confederate soldiers took the initiative to dig in, Lee did not give out a general order to fortify positions. He was sure that Burnside would not launch a frontal assault against his position, and he wanted his men to be able to move quickly up or down the river to confront Burnside. In this respect, Lee was wrong. After constructing the 5 pontoon bridges across the Rappahannock River, the Union Army moved across, having to fight their way across the bridges and through the town. Major General Franklin's left Grand Division assembled on the Union left across from Jackson's corps on December 12th. Burnside personally rode across the river and inspected Jackson's position for himself. After seeing the light defenses, he and Franklin decided on a battle plan. They concluded that the enemy's defenses in Franklin's sector were weaker than Sumner's to the right. Franklin recommended a fast strike against Prospect Hill the next morning, but with several caveats. The attack must begin before dawn, so his men could cross the open ground without excessive casualties, and sizable reinforcements from Hooker's Center Grand Division were needed to guard the bridges. Burnside agreed and promised that the orders to this effect would be forthcoming, mounted his horse, and rode back north, possibly to confer with Sumner once again. Burnside had not been sleeping well leading up to December 13th. After he left Franklin, he most likely slept a few hours before rising early on the 13th to formulate his battle plan in order to send it off to his Grand Division commanders. General Franklin, who was under the impression that the orders were to be forthcoming later that night on the 12th, had stayed up awaiting his orders. He sent a telegram to Burnside at midnight about his instructions, but was informed that the orders would be sent when they were ready. A messenger with Franklin's orders rode out from Burnside's headquarters about 6 a.m. The roads were icy and the rider had to travel at a snail's pace and would not reach Franklin until 7:30 a.m., way past the planned dawn attack. Franklin's mind did not ease when he got his orders. What he read did not equal what he and Burnside had discussed the evening before. It read, "Keep your whole command in position for a rapid movement down the Old Richmond Road, and you will send out at once a division at least to seize if possible the height near Captain Hamilton's, taking care to keep it well supported and its line of retreat open." Franklin interpreted this as meaning he was to use one division to attack Prospect Hill, while the main thrust would be to his right in General Sumner's sector. Sumner also received ambiguous orders. At dawn on the Confederate side, Lee could hear the sounds of the Union Army, but fog blocked his view. Out of the fog came General Longstreet, and he began warming himself at the roaring fire. General Jeb Stuart arrived next, taking a spot next to the fire. Finally, General Jackson appeared. 2 of his divisions had not made it to the field, those under Jubal Early and D.H. Hill. Longstreet playfully asked Stonewall if he was concerned about the buildup of Federal troops in his front. "Perhaps I'll frighten them after a while," he replied. Jackson suggested to Lee that they should attack before the fog burned off and pin the Union Army between them and the river, but Lee thought that too risky and decided to wear down the Union ranks before launching a strike of their own. Jackson's position was strong, except for a 600-yard swampy area that his men did not want to occupy in the cold December weather. General Gregg's men occupied a position behind the swamp in case Union forces sought to penetrate their line at that point. Stonewall had also assembled 54 artillery pieces to cover the open terrain in front of his infantry. Although General Franklin was aggravated at his orders, he requested no clarification, and Burnside offered none. Instead of attacking Lee's right with tens of thousands of men, Franklin chose to send in 1 division, that under George Meade. Meade's division was an easy choice. It was the most seasoned of the 3 forming the First Corps, and George Meade was a superior general officer. Its numbers had dwindled as the war dragged on. It marched out of Pennsylvania in 1861 with more than 10,000 men, and now counted just 3,400. The addition of 2 large regiments, the 121st and 142nd Pennsylvania, swelled the division's numbers by more than 1,000. Meade's brigades began to file into their assigned positions as Meade and 1st Corps Commander John Reynolds observed the Confederate infantry locations. It was about 10 a.m. when the 2 generals looked on the rebels on Prospect Hill, and about that time, the artillery shells began dropping into the Union ranks from a lone gun positioned just south of them on the Bowling Green Road. Major John Pelham, an Alabamian and an artillery officer from Jeb Stuart's horse artillery, begged his commander to allow him to take 1 Napoleon and take up an advanced position and fire on the Yankees. Stuart relented, and Pelham went to work. Meade ordered his men to lay down to avoid being hit, but that did not stop the Confederate shells from killing and injuring numerous men. Reynolds scrambled to move as many artillery pieces as he could find to silence Pelham. In all, about 30 pieces of Union artillery dueled with the lone rebel gun. When Federal artillery would find their range on Pelham, the Alabamian would hitch up the piece and move to another location. Pelham scored a direct hit on 1 gun and another direct hit on a limber chest, along with incapacitating numerous men and horses. Stuart became concerned for his artilleryman and asked him to fall back 3 separate times, but the young man refused. Finally, Stuart sent a Blakely rifle to a location between Jackson's infantry and Pelham's gun to relieve pressure on the single Napoleon, but the Blakely was taken out by a direct hit. Eventually, Union artillery had injured enough men and horses that Pelham was forced to retreat, not to mention Abner Doubleday's division started forming up on Meade's left. The engagement between Pelham and the Union gunners is one of the more famous artillery duels of the war, and it did more than just cause a nuisance for Reynolds. It delayed him from launching an attack for an hour, thus giving Jackson plenty enough time to shore up his position. At 11 a.m., Reynolds directed his artillery at the Confederate line. For 30 minutes, they shelled the rebel positions, but more damage was done in the rear of the Southern battle lines because the Federal artillery was overshooting their mark. Jackson kept his artillery from counterfiring. He knew his artillery was no match for the Yankees' firepower and reserved his ammunition for the infantry that he expected would assault at any moment. At 11:30 a.m., the director of Reynolds' artillery sent word to Reynolds that he had knocked apart the enemy's defenses. Sadly for Reynolds, he was wrong. Meade's division stepped off about 11:30 and crossed the open field toward the enemy. The silence made many blue-clad soldiers believe that the Confederates had left during the bombardment, but the rebel artillery were waiting for them to get within perfect range. Prior to the battle, artillerymen in that sector had stepped off the distance from their guns into the open fields, and even marked 800 yards with stakes and made mental notes of certain landmarks to indicate how far the enemy would be away at each location. When Meade's men stepped within the 800 yards, around 50 artillery pieces opened up from the Confederate line. The roar was deafening, and the shock to the Federal troops so severe that Meade ordered his men to fall back to a small ravine to avoid being destroyed. Now that the rebel artillery had given up their locations, Reynolds ordered his artillery to blast away at the enemy. For over an hour, the two sides flung iron at one another. All the while, Meade's men were caught in a crossfire, laying on their bellies, hugging the ground for safety. When numerous guns and men were silenced on each side, Meade's division once again advanced. The division commander watched his men begin scaling Prospect Hill, but noticed that the 13th Pennsylvania Reserves were not moving. He asked its commander why, and he told Meade that he had been ordered to guard the artillery. Meade ordered the regiment to the front, but it did not fall in line with its fellow regiments, but squeezed into a gap within Conrad Jackson's battle line. Meade's two brigades on the right hit the Confederate line in the gap created by the swampy forest. Sinclair's men were astonished when no small arms fire was directed at them, even though Conrad Jackson's brigade sustained heavy losses from small arms fire and enfilading fire from the Confederate artillery batteries. Meade sent orders to General Jackson to move his brigade to the right towards Sinclair, then sweep his brigade to the left, clearing out the Confederates currently in his front. The messenger rode off to find Jackson, but before the rider arrived, Jackson's horse was shot out from under him, confusing the general in the fall. As the rider saluted, a bullet plunged into his chest, and seconds later, a bullet tore into the skull of Jackson. For the moment, the brigade was leaderless. Because of the chaos of battle, Jackson's second in command did not know his commander had been killed, so the brigade hung in a limbo-like state, firing back at the rebels across the railroad. Sinclair, Meade's other brigade commander, was wounded in the foot early in the advance, and the lack of leadership caused his regiments to act on their own until the second in command could restore order. Nevertheless, Jackson's brigade duked it out with Archer's Tennesseans, but neither gained a significant advantage. Sinclair's brigade moved over the tracks, finding no enemy in their front. As McGilton's men moved over the railroad, the 37th North Carolina of Lane's brigade delivered volleys into the green 142nd Pennsylvania. The new recruits hid behind the back of the tracks, exposing the flank of the 8th Pennsylvania Reserves. Sinclair's regiments pushed on up Prospect Hill through a dense brush of trees and blackberry bushes. Ahead of them sat Maxcy Gregg's South Carolinians. The men from the Palmetto State didn't expect an attack to impact them, since they were in the second line of defense. So they had stacked arms, sat around, drank coffee, and snacked on what food they had in their haversacks, not hearing or suspecting the Pennsylvanians to be approaching their flank. The 1st South Carolina Rifles, also called Orr's Rifles, were the first to see the movement in the bushes and grabbed their rifles and started shooting. General Gregg, hearing the roar of battle from one of his regiments, rode to them and ordered them to stop firing, that they were firing on friends. The men stacked arms, but then the 1st and 6th Pennsylvania advanced into the South Carolinians, resulting in hand-to-hand combat. Because of his mistake, Gregg was shot on the left side and the bullet severed his spine. His men would take him to a nearby house where he would die the next day. The two rightmost regiments of Gregg's brigade melted away after being hit in their front and in their flank. The 12th, 13th, and 14th South Carolina swung to the right to hopefully stop the oncoming Federals, but the momentum was on the Union side, and they fled to the rear. To the south, Sinclair's men were approaching the flank of Archer's Tennesseans. The 13th Pennsylvania Reserves, who had gotten separated from the brigade, saw their comrades moving up the hill. They disengaged and worked their way up the hill in support. The 2nd and 7th Pennsylvania Reserves released a devastating volley into the 19th Georgia. The Georgians were so taken by surprise that they nearly all fled from their fortified location. The 14th Tennessee to their right berated the men from Georgia and even turned their rifles against them and fired at them for fleeing the battle. However, it wouldn't be long before the 14th also gave way. A Pennsylvania officer found a huddled mass of Confederates in the trench and asked them if they would like to surrender. The Southerners said, "If you'll let us," and they were walked into Union lines. Archer attempted to stop the flank attack by moving the 5th Alabama Battalion to the left of his line, but there was no stopping the Union advance, and the rest of his brigade skedaddled. While Meade's brigades were plunging through the hole in the Confederate line, Meade himself could see that without support, his men would be repulsed and lose all that had been gained in the attack. During the attack, Meade spotted a junior officer racing to the rear in a panic. Meade ordered him back to his men with what one historian called a stream of oaths that had made his temper legendary within the Army. The skulker raised his rifle to take aim at the division commander, but before he could fire, Meade brought his sword down on his head so hard that he snapped the blade in two. This time, when Meade repeated his order to return to the front, the officer complied. With his near-death experience behind him, the division commander called on General Reynolds to move John Gibbon's division up to support his right flank. Gibbon's men had been stuck in a crossfire between the two groups of artillery pieces and hadn't ventured out, but with orders from Reynolds and encouragement from Meade, Gibbon moved out his men. During the advance, Meade attempted to hold his position by sending McGilton's right two regiments against Lane's North Carolinians, who he feared might flank his courageous men. Gibbon's lead brigade, under Brigadier General Nelson Taylor, approached the Tar Heels at the railroad. The Pennsylvanians and New Yorkers halted, and many fell to the ground to shield themselves from the hail of lead. The galling fire was too much for the 11th Pennsylvania and the 83rd New York. They broke for the rear, but luckily for Taylor, Colonel Lyle's brigade came up in support. Taylor moved the 97th New York and the 88th Pennsylvania to the right to make room for Lyle's regiments. The two sides threw lead at one another at a tremendous rate. By this time, Colonel Root was moving his men up, and as he approached the front lines, Lyle's 90th Pennsylvania and 26th New York fell back in order to refill their cartridge boxes. Root was dismayed when they left, and after a short conference with Taylor and Lyle, decided the only way to stay alive was to charge the Confederate position. So Root's men fell into line alongside Taylor and Lyle. The blue-clad troops fixed bayonets and surged toward Lane's men. Hand-to-hand combat broke out, but the Tar Heels gave way. Lane was able to get the 33rd North Carolina to put up some resistance to allow his men to make it to safety, but they were also obliged to fall back. Stonewall Jackson's front line had been destroyed, sent flying by the divisions of General Meade and General Gibbon. But now the Federal troops had to hang on to that costly gained ground. The attack had drained the blue troops of energy and men. The regiments were tangled and organization was lacking. Brigade commanders hurriedly attempted to prepare their men for a defense of the ground, but Stonewall had already sent for reinforcements to fill the gap created by Meade's division. On Jackson's left, Pender's brigade approached Gibbon's tired division, and on the right, the brigades of Atkinson, Hoke, Hayes, Walker, and the Stonewall Brigade, most of them from Early's division, advanced to beat back the Federal breakthrough. As the Pennsylvania reserves rested, two Confederate brigades made their way down the slope of Prospect Hill. Paxton, the commander of the famed Stonewall Brigade, was remembered by his enlisted men as always wanting to enter battle with perfect alignment, and even in the heat of battle would call for the line to be dressed. Today was no exception. He halted the brigade and ordered them to dress. Colonel James Walker got frustrated at Paxton's slowness and moved his brigade through Paxton's lines, causing Paxton himself to become irate. If nothing else, it had disrupted his alignment once again. Walker's men slammed into the Keystone Staters and sent them down the hill. Paxton deployed his brigade toward the right to push back the 3rd Pennsylvania Reserves and the 121st Pennsylvania. On Jackson's left, Thomas's brigade of Georgians were arriving and deployed to the right of Lane's restored brigade. In the meantime, Colonel Root rode to General Gibbon and asked what he was to do. Gibbon told him to take the slope. Root did as he was told and prepared his men for another assault. His brigade moved against the Georgians and Tar Heels, with help from the 136th Pennsylvania, but the overwhelming numbers of the Confederates forced Root to pull back to the railroad. When the blue troops fell back, Thomas's brigade moved against them, with Lane's Tar Heels following behind. Together they forced Gibbon's men from the railroad. To the south, Atkinson's Georgians had swept away much of the Union resistance in their front, but elements of General Birney's division under General Ward had arrived to support Meade's attack, but they were too late. Now they were simply trying to stop any rebel counterstrikes. When Ward's men reached the railroad, they met Atkinson's Georgians, and a short but bloody engagement began between the two sides. Ward reported that he lost 300 out of the 800 men under his command in less than 5 minutes. The 61st and 60th Georgia flanked Ward's men and drove them from the railroad cut. and continued on. The rebels were driving toward the enemy near the Bowling Green Road, and Atkinson could not stop them. One Union soldier wrote that the Georgians came running out of the woods with no sense of alignment or organization. The brigade swept aside the 57th Pennsylvania, which had been sent to support their sister regiments. Then, 36 cannons opened up on them with canister. The destruction was mesmerizing to the Federals, watching it take place. The volleys from the artillery cut huge swaths out of Atkinson's battle line and momentarily halted them. But when General Robinson's brigade attacked, it was too much for the Georgians. They had been devastated, and their commander, Colonel Atkinson, had been captured in their assault. With the last Confederate brigade driven back across the railroad, the fighting ended between Jackson's Corps and Reynolds' Corps. The fight had been devastating. Gibbon's division lost 1,267 men, and Meade's division lost 1,853. Birney's division, although arriving late in the battle, lost 950, and even Doubleday's division, which sat relatively unengaged, lost 214. On the southern side, the casualties were lighter, but still damaging. A.P. Hill's division lost 1,619 men, being the main force engaged by Reynolds' Corps. However, to illustrate the devastation of the Union artillery, Atkinson's Georgians, part of Early's division, lost 719 killed and wounded, with more than 100 captured, bringing the total casualties of one brigade to over 800. One Union soldier walked the fields in front of the Union artillery and commented that he found dead and dying Georgians, heads off, legs off, and arms. If that was not slaughter, I give up. Thank you so much for watching and supporting the channel. I hope this clarified what occurred during the Battle of Fredericksburg. I will be animating Stones River at the end of the month, so please head on over to the Patreon and join for just $1, and you can vote for which aspect to be animated. As always, thank you again for watching, and have a great day.
Historian, historian, where do you roam? Historian, historian, far, far from home. Half history will travel, reads the card of a man. A professor with knowledge in the heartland. To educate the world is his mission. A professor of fortune is a man called historian. Historian.